Hi, it's Angela Egan with Accelerated Learning. Welcome to Not an ELA Problem in Every Classroom Opportunity. Today we are going to take time to talk about the structures and routines that will support all of your learners with reading, thinking, and writing like an expert in their field. We aren't just teaching our students to read. We are teaching them to read differently depending on the room that they are in. Each discipline has its own vocabulary, methods of thinking, and expectations for how people communicate. Our goal is that if we were going to drop our students in front of a room of authors or historians or scientists or mathematicians, we want to make sure that they can communicate effectively with those people. So our job as educators is to model that disciplinary thinking and provide opportunities for them to independently apply what they have learned so that they can become experts in that field. When we're talking about reading in the disciplines, we're going to break down the routines into three groups. We have our before reading, our during reading, and our after reading routines. Our before reading routines are really just there to prepare our students for the text. We want to make sure that they have some knowledge about the topic so that as we dive a little bit deeper into the text, it's not unfamiliar to them. And so before reading is where we set a clear purpose. We go over the learning objectives for that day. We take time to decode any unfamiliar words. We talk about the meaning of some of those vocabulary words in the text that the students are going to see. We break down any challenging language and we talk about the text structure so that our students understand the framework that the experts use to read, write, and think in their fields. And then during reading is where we focus on routines that really help our students think while they read instead of just getting through the words. This is what helps them to notice how experts in a discipline use evidence, explain ideas, and organize information. This is where we are really taking the time to model our thought process and guide our students with understanding how an expert in that field approaches a text. And then after reading routines are there to help our students put ideas together, right? We really want to help our readers process, summarize, and critically analyze what they just read. And that's where we can assign independent tasks. We can have students work collaboratively in groups. We can provide them with graphic organizers and materials to really show us what they've learned. And now I'm going to take a few minutes to break down each of these routines for you. So before reading, as I mentioned, that's where you're really establishing your purpose and you're telling your students what they are doing today, why they are doing it, help them understand the real world application of that, and then take time to go over the text structure. You want to point out key words, key vocabulary words. You want to point out any key features that relate to the text structure of the passage or of the content, because looking at how a text is organized before you read is going to help you think like an expert in that field. It gives you a roadmap for understanding. And it also helps you figure out the author's purpose, right? When we're thinking about the author's purpose, we're moving beyond to persuade, to inform, to entertain. You want your readers asking, what is at stake, right? So it's really important that you're taking time to go over that text structure and to help them understand why you chose this text, why they're reading this passage today. Because this is really going to prepare your students' brains for the kind of thinking that this subject requires. And then you want to take time to really help your students build the knowledge that they need to understand the text. All of our students are in different places when it comes to bringing knowledge to the table, right? Some of our students may have knowledge on the topic that we're teaching, others may not. We don't want to guess or just make assumptions. We want to make sure we're taking time to give all of them an opportunity to build their understanding of the topic. Each subject has its own words, ideas, and ways of thinking. A quick preview of vocabulary words, a quick preview of maybe a quote or a quick video clip can really lower any confusion that your students may have and prepare them to notice important ideas instead of just getting stuck on an unfamiliar concept. It gives them something to visualize and think about while you are breaking down the text. Here are some routines that you can put into place to support your students with their background knowledge on a topic. This first one is called categories and labels. And so you take a group of words that are related to the topic that you are going over for that day. And then this can be done independently or in a group. And then you want your students to put these words into groups and then to label them, right? So the goal is that prior to reading, your students are being exposed to new vocabulary words. You're taking time to help them decode those words, understand the meaning of those words, and then you want them to be able to justify, right, their word groups, why they labeled them the way that they did, right? This is really to help you better understand what your students already know about this topic, and then it helps you guide your instruction so that it's more targeted to your students' needs. And then this activity is really simple. You take your topic and you present your topic to that students, and then you ask them to write 10 to 15 words that they are thinking about when they hear that topic. And then you can really set a timer for this and just do, 1 to 2 minutes. It should be quick because your students who have knowledge on the topic are going to be able to write down words really quickly. And your students who are struggling, you're going to be able to identify that within the first 30 seconds of giving them this task. And then you want your students to think, pair, and share, right? They're thinking, they're writing, pair up with a partner, and then share their thoughts, share their ideas so that they can start to learn from one another through this process. And then after you've taken time to build their background knowledge, you can support them with making some predictions, right? If you're making predictions before reading, it's going to be helpful because it gets your students' brains ready to notice important ideas, and it gives them a purpose for reading that helps them connect new information to what they already know. So in math, that may look like them predicting results, right? In science, maybe they're using models to state a testable hypothesis. In history, maybe they're predicting arguments or consequences based on context. Language arts, that can mean predicting plot turns or rhetorical moves. So the purpose of doing this is to just get their brains thinking about the content. And the more that they're thinking about the content, the more they're going to be actively engaged in the lesson. And active engagement is really crucial for student learning. This is all of these routines are really important, but the vocabulary routines are extremely important because here is where you can really take time to break down any unfamiliar words by first providing your students with multisyllabic word routines where you can introduce the word, you model how to decode that word, which we're going to look at next, right? You have them pronounce it, they write it, they read it. You can tell them a kid-friendly definition of what that word means, provide visual supports. It's really important that you're providing visuals because that's also going to support all of your learners. Say more about the word using a strategy like the Frere's method or asking yes or no questions related to that word, and then have your students use that word and understand the importance of that word in the lesson that they are going to be working on for that day. So these are just routine. This is just a vocabulary routine you can implement on a daily basis. As I mentioned with your vocabulary words, you really want to pick maybe 1 to 3 words. I would start with 1 word until you feel comfortable using the routines, and then you can slowly add more words into your pre-reading routines. And then the first thing you want to do is you want to introduce the vocabulary word, but then you want to take time to decode that word. This routine is really going to help your students who are struggling with foundational skills, because here's an opportunity for you to show students how we can break apart the word into meaningful parts and then scoop that word to be able to decode it. And there's a couple of different multisyllabic word reading routines. One is where you have your students circle the prefix, box the suffix, underline your vowels, and then scoop the word. You can also have your students break the word apart into morphemes, so the smallest unit in a word that holds meaning. So for example, if our word is proportional, some students may notice the prefix pro. Some students may say, oh, I see the word portion, right? Part of, to share. And so they may recognize that. Some may notice the suffix all, right? So you want them to be able to look at a word and to break it apart. And then after I would model doing one vocabulary word, you showing them how to break a word apart using either syllable division rules or having them break it apart into morphemes. Honestly, since we're talking about middle school and secondary learners, I would probably show them both ways so that you can teach them to be flexible with the words, because they may not recognize some of these morphemes. So if you teach them just some quick syllable division rules as you're going over some words, that may also help the students who are working on those basic literacy skills. And then you want to tell them the definition. Have them use that word in a sentence, and then the words that you're choosing should really be meaningful words that they're going to see in the text that day. But this is very important, and so I would say if you start with anything after this session, start by breaking down some of your vocabulary words using a multisyllabic word dictation routine. There's also some vocabulary routines that you can incorporate after you've introduced a group of words. So this one's called the concept circle, and you provide your students with 4 words. You do not have to print anything out. You can put this up on your screen. You can draw it on your whiteboard and just put 4 words. And your goal is that your students can describe the meaning and the relationship between and among the group of words. So I would honestly have my students first think for 30 seconds or a minute and have them turn and talk to somebody next to them. And then we would do a share out of those words. And once again, you want to choose words that are related to their learning for that day. If you introduced a vocabulary word using the multisyllabic word routine, you want to incorporate that word into this activity because you want everything to be connected. You don't want your instruction to feel like it's piecemealed. Everything should have a purpose, and that requires intentional planning. And then another activity is called the concept ladder. This is really where you would introduce this at the beginning of a lesson or a unit. You would take your big idea. There's 4 parts to it. You have kind. What is it a kind of? What is it a part of? You have stage. What is it a stage of? You have the product. What is it a product of? Or what are the products of it? So you have 4 parts, right? And then basically you have your big idea, which is your concept. And then you have different questions, different labels that you can come up with, different ideas. And not all of these in this chart may relate to your topic. So you have to pick and choose what makes the most sense for what you're working on. But the goal is that it helps your students explain a complex idea from multiple angles and not just define it. It supports deeper vocabulary and content understanding at the same time. This is not something that's just one and done. I would introduce this at the beginning of a lesson, maybe put on an anchor chart. And then as you're going through a lesson or a unit, you would add to this. And once again, any of these routines, you want to make sure you're taking time to model. And after you've done it 1 or 2 times, then you can start to have your students try to do these things on their own. And then here's an example of what it looks like in different subjects. So in history, maybe you have the concept of justice. And then so all of the information is going to be related to justice and help your students gain a deeper understanding of what that means and what it looks like in the world around them. Science, you may use the concept metamorphosis. In math, maybe you're going to use proportional reasoning, right? When we go back to thinking about those vocabulary words, choose a vocabulary word that you want to use for one of these activities, right? So then they don't just hear the word and it's one and done. Now they see the connection between it and what they're doing. They're going to hear it on a regular basis. And then guess what? Over time, they're going to start to use that language and they're going to have a deeper understanding of its meaning because they've been able to apply it in so many different ways. And the last activity is called contextual redefinition. This is where you give your students a word. So once again, take the word that you're using that you introduced during the multisyllabic word routine, right? Proportional. All right, have your students predict, what do you think this word means, right? Well, recognize portion, part of, pro, maybe they know the prefix or the suffix. Have them come up with a definition. And then you're going to give them a sentence, right? Or give them an example of how that word is used in a sentence. And then they're going to have to come up with a new definition. Maybe they're going to keep their definition or come up with a new definition. And then talk about the context clues that they used to help them come up with the definition that they did. So once again, these are not elaborate long lessons. Your vocabulary routine should really be 2 to 3 minutes. So you want to make sure that you really focus on your pacing, and that's why I say start with one word first, and then as you become more comfortable, then you can start to add more words. You do not have to do multiple vocabulary activities or routines in a day. I would say you pick one routine that you can try to be consistent with, and then practice that regularly so that your students feel comfortable using that strategy. And then you want to take time to break down any complex sentences that your students may encounter for that day during their reading. And so in math, when I talk about a text reading, that could look like a word problem, right? So you want to focus on any confusing words or language that they may encounter, and you want to draw their attention to that prior to the reading so that they don't have to spend too much time during the reading and get caught up in words or language that's unfamiliar to them. So in science, maybe you're looking at some technical terms. In history, maybe you're examining some source-specific vocabulary words that they're unfamiliar with. In language arts, figurative language is very confusing for many students. So if the text you're reading incorporates figurative language, take time to break down one sentence, show them what it means, explain it to them. This is really important because you want to make sure that all of your students, once they get into that text and once you're talking about the text, can really access the content. So these are supports that you can put into place to make sure that all of your students have the best opportunity to succeed with that lesson that day. And then we get into during reading strategies, right? During reading strategies are where you have the opportunity to really model your thought process. You want to guide your students through the thought process, and you want to support them with thinking, reading, and writing like an expert. So when we think of reading skills, right, some people, getting the gist is a very common strategy used to help students better understand the main idea and important details in a story. Annotating is very beneficial across all content areas. Asking and answering questions, that's where your students are going to gain a deeper understanding of the content. And then strategies like imaging can help all of your students begin to visualize and really understand the concepts that are being presented to them. So during reading, you really want to work on mastering your pacing so that after reading each section or each word problem, you ask your students, right? Who or what is this mostly about? What's the most important information they want us to know in math? Maybe you're looking for, sometimes, there's a lot of fluff in some of the content that's presented to us. So you want them to be able to find the what. What is the most important thing that we need to figure out in this problem? Maybe in science, right, what natural event is being explained. In history, thinking about who is involved, what is the central conflict. And then in language arts, maybe they're thinking about what is the author's message about the human condition, right? So whatever area you're teaching, you want to take time to break down the text and have your students start to think about the important information and weed out anything that's unnecessary. Annotating is going to help all of your learners. You want them to be able to have clear structures and routines to break down and find the most important information. So in literacy, like I mentioned earlier, we can circle the prefix, box the suffix for multisyllabic word reading routines. However, when you're actually reading the text, how do you want them to underline the important information? How do you want them to figure out the information that they actually need? Do you want them to underline? Do you want them to circle? In math, do you want them to circle the variables, box the units? Come up with routines that you can use and implement on a regular basis, because that's what's going to help them better understand how to differentiate what's important and what's not. And then questioning. You want to be really meaningful. You want to choose really meaningful questions and be really intentional with your planning of the questions. The questions should relate back to the purpose and their objective for that day. The goal should be that by the time they are done answering the question, they are able to think more like an expert in that field, or answer like an expert in that field, or write like an expert in that field. And then on the next slide, I'm going to show you some ways that you can just support them with that. We don't want to assume that our students know how to respond to a question, so we want to give them sentence stems. We want to give them sentence stems that relate back to how an expert in that field would speak or how they would write. So you want to make sure you are providing these on the board so everybody can use them if they need to, and if they don't, that's okay too. But you want to provide these opportunities for all of your students because everyone could benefit from understanding the language that experts, understand the language of how experts in that field speak, read, or write. And then imaging is a strategy that, we often think of using it in the younger grades. However, it's extremely beneficial for our older students as well, right? We want them to be able to visualize what that diagram looks like, or visualize the process, or visualize the setting or a scenario in history. We want them to visualize being in that moment, so they can really understand and feel what people during that time period felt. And then maybe in language arts, they're creating a mental movie of a scene so they can feel the character's tension or understand the voice. The goal is that when you're using these strategies, you want them to feel like they're an expert in what they're doing. And then we have our after reading strategies. Our after reading strategies are really where our students are going to put all of the information they learned together. You want to be really intentional with what you choose for your students to do after reading. And once again, it should be related to what an expert in that field would do. Don't have your students just answer a question just to answer a question, right? Think about what experts in that field do, right? We know historians study documents, artifacts, other sources to understand the past. So maybe we're going to have our students, study a document and or study an artifact and have to come up with their own conclusions or ideas. Maybe for language arts, right? What do authors do? Authors use ideas, they use research, they use creativity to write clearly for a purpose and audience. So maybe our students are going to do that. What do scientists do? They observe, they test, they analyze, right? So in science, your students could be working independently or in a group to test a hypothesis, to, just better understand how the natural world works. Mathematicians look for patterns, they use logic, they justify their reasons. So maybe you provide your students with an example and they have to provide a logical reason as to what the solution is. But you want to choose meaningful things and you want to provide as much real world application as you possibly can so that your students understand that there is value in what they are doing. And then, as I mentioned, some independent application activities. These were a little bit more specific, more project-based. Maybe you give your students a set of flawed proofs, and they have to debug the logic, write a formal correction, explain why the error occurred. Maybe in science, you're giving them a current environmental or health issue where they have to synthesize their sources into a one-page briefing with a recommended solution. Maybe in history, the students have to curate an exhibit of 3 to 4 primary sources and write curator notes for each that explains the source's bias, context, and purpose. And then maybe in language arts, they have to select a controversial text and rewrite a key scene from the perspective of an opposing character. Choose something meaningful that is going to help them gain a deeper understanding of what an expert in that field would do and what that ultimately would look like. And I wanted to share some activities like this because in a few seconds, I'm going to show you just kind of a sample schedule where you can assign a task or a project, and that would open up some opportunities for you to pull some small groups for students who need some more support with foundational skills. It's important that your content is accessible for all. We cannot make assumptions in education, right? We need to ground everything in data. And if we don't have the data, then that may mean that we may need to administer some diagnostic assessments so that we do have data, because we have to know where our students are. We have to know what our students are capable of doing. Can our students read a basic text? Do they have those basic foundational skills? Can they write words? If you don't know, you have to administer an assessment. And that can be time consuming, but that's where you can reach out to your coaches or support staff to see if other people can support you with administering some tests. You want to make sure if you're providing an excerpt or a passage or a source. If it's really complicated, full of a lot of text, how can you break that down? How can you simplify that text? How can you maybe enlarge the text? And maybe highlight some keywords, vocabulary words, underline, but you need to break down a complex text for your students. And then provide vocabulary words. As I mentioned, you have those vocabulary words in the beginning, keep them on the board. You create a word bank so that if your students are expected to respond using specific language, have it on the board for them to use. Have your sentence stems written on the board for them. You can alter any sentences for clarity. You may have to modify a source for some of your students so that they can access it. So just really think about being intentional with your supports, and just remember that making content accessible for all is really important, because everybody should be able to access what you are doing. We cannot just expect our students to do things. We have to make sure we're putting supports in place that will help them with being successful. And here's a sample schedule that I just kind of put together. Just if you have, like, say, a 45-minute block, right? You have 25 to 30 minutes where you can really spend on your before, your during reading routines, and then during those after reading routines where you assign a task or a project, you can maybe pull 1 to 2 quick check-in groups for that second 15 to 20 minutes. Maybe you pull 2 groups or 2 students for 10 minutes and you work with them on some of the skills that they need to be able to access the content. And that's something you can do on a regular basis. I would say maybe Monday through Thursday. And then if possible, you can leave your Friday block as a time for your review with your whole group, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And then maybe you can pull 1 to 2 small groups where you can focus on some of those foundational skills if your students are really struggling to access the content. This is, like I said, it's a sample schedule. I know times are different. However, if you do not have strong systems of support in place in your district or in your school, you want to think about ways that you can maximize your time in the classroom with your students, because the time they have with you is very valuable, very precious, and you want to make sure that everyone has equal opportunities to be successful in the classroom. And the biggest thing is you want to foster that expert mindset, right? Stop asking, did you understand the text? Start asking, what would a scientist say about this question? What would a historian question? Start asking questions that force your students to read, think, and write like an expert in that field. This was a lot of information. My goal today was to just show you what structures and routines should be in place on a regular basis to support all of your learners. I would say start small. Start with one routine that you can implement on a regular basis, and then start to layer in other steps or other routines. And then as you become more comfortable, the ultimate goal would be able to incorporate all of these routines into your daily lessons. And that's where you would have to pay attention to your pacing. And that's something that takes time to work on. So don't feel overwhelmed. Choose one routine and frame it through your discipline's lens. And just remember, literacy is the language of every discipline. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is angela@acceleratelearning.us. I'm also going to provide you with a free resource that is going to simplify all of these routines that we just went over. It's a disciplinary literacy guide, and it's going to, it uses teacher-friendly language and will help you with your pacing and your lesson flow as you start to incorporate some of these routines into your daily practice. Any questions, reach out. Thank you for your time today. And just remember, it is not an ELA problem. It is every classroom opportunity.